So you want to learn Russian, or you just want to see what some Slavs have to deal with every day. Klasno. You're a complete beginner. Where do you start? Well, everyone has to start with the Cyrillic alphabet, which, even though it looks scary, is the easiest part of learning Russian. Why? Well, because if you speak English, then you'll recognize most of the sounds already. For example, this A is an A and this T is a T. You just need to get your brain to realize that some of them look like English letters, like this H and P, but really make the N and R sounds respectively. This L that looks like a lampshade is my favorite. And the ones that don't exist in English, well, aren't that bad, since you probably have already heard them in CSGO. But if not, you have the J, Ya, Yu, Yo, the S bros, tst, and I, which are easy enough to imitate with some practice. Remaining, we have the soft and hard signs, which are really cool because instead of having their own sounds, they just affect the letter preceding them. Here's the difference.
Сесть, сесть, съесть.
So now you got the alphabet down and a few words in your pocket. Maybe you learned how to introduce yourself by saying ya, then your name, or got a little more fancy with gubka bob kvadratные штаны. Easy. You're probably thinking, geez, I thought this was supposed to be hard, and just like my ex-wife, you're right. Just give it a minute. We have a long way to go before we can even construct a simple sentence like I'm going home, which we'll come back to later, unless you're parentless. By this point, you've found some beginner materials and most likely made some miscellaneous observations about the language, like how there's no verb for to be, except when there is, and how Russians switch the order of words around a lot, and you would be right. But then again, no matter how hard you try, you can never pass those filthy Duolingo prompts when you have to write the sentence for yourself, because the words keep changing.
Why? Why?
Well, there are three things about the Russian language that make it particularly difficult, and the first is cases. In order to understand what cases are and what they do, we have to understand why Russian has a flexible word order. Because normally, this would be a problem. Because if you had a sentence like, Tom punched Ben, and you were able to switch the words around any way you wanted to, then how will you know who punched who? You kinda have a broken language there. Russian solves this problem by changing the endings of nouns, adjectives, numerals, pronouns, possessives, etc. based on the nature of the sentence. So if we go back to our original example of Tom punched Ben, after we Russified the sentence by adding in the correct case endings to our haymaker throwing subject Tom and the object Ben, the guy getting socked in the face, the position of them in the sentence does not matter because the endings signal to Russians who is doing what to whom. Even if we moved the words around to Ben punched Tom, it'll still mean Tom punched Ben. And if you think that's confusing, that's okay, because it's going to get way harder. We're barely half chubbing right now. You see, these are only 2 of 6 cases, and since Russian is a gendered language, within each case are different endings for masculine, feminine, and neuter words, with each subgroup having yet more endings for singular and plural. Remember all that stuff I said earlier? Yeah, each part of speech has different endings too. Not to mention all the exceptions that exist within each case, differing adjective-verb stem endings, certain cases being triggered after specific prepositions and verbs which need to be memorized, and this is just scratching the surface. Don't be discouraged to learn them though. It's really rewarding, and the best way I found is to write the rules in a notebook along with some examples and then just go read stuff in Russian and look back at your notebook when you don't understand why something has the ending that it does. Remember that even native Russian speakers make grammatical mistakes with cases all the time. And most of the time, using the wrong case ending won't stop you from having an awesome interaction with someone else. Keep in mind, we're still beginners, but assuming that we now have at least a foundational knowledge of cases and how they work, can we at least start saying basic sentences like, I'm going home? Well, no, because we're yet to learn the second thing that makes Russian hard: motion verbs. In English, we use the verb to go, along with words for specific actions like walk, swim, etc., and that's about it. But in Russian, there is a distinction made between how you're moving and in what direction. For example, if you're making a one-way trip somewhere on foot, that is a different verb from making a round trip. And this is only if you're traveling on foot. If you're in a car, there are different verbs based on the directions we mentioned before. And if you're carrying something in that car, that's a whole new set of verbs. And I forgot to mention earlier that each verb has 6 different conjugations per tense, but at least those are predictable after a while, except when they're not. Basically, there are hundreds of these things, and they're all very specific, which is actually really cool because it allows you to express yourself with more precision than you could do in a Germanic language like English. So in order to correctly translate a sentence like I'm going home, we need to be a little more specific. For simplicity's sake, let's say it's a one-way trip on foot. We'd conjugate the verb et and then smack the word for home on the end there and call it a day, right? Well, no, because home isn't a noun, it's an adverb, which answers the question where. Not this where, but the where used for motion. Meaning we have to change dom to домой, even though it has no case. I've literally read millions of words in Russian and I still don't know what that means. A slight reprieve in all this is that Russian tenses are actually very easy with few exceptions. There's only the past, present, and future. Remember the verb to be from earlier? It's actually used to make the future tense. All you gotta do is conjugate it, put it before another verb, and bam, that's all there is to it. It's also used to make general statements like to be happy is a good thing. The past is almost as easy to form, and these two things combined will dramatically increase your ability to communicate. It's like being able to jump in a pool of water after going through the fire that is Russian grammar. So now that you have a decent understanding of cases, motion verbs, and tenses, you've officially graduated to the intermediate level. But there's still a long way to go, so what's next? The fastest way to advance from this point is to get as much comprehensible input as possible, which means read and listen to stuff in Russian that you can understand about 80 to 85% of. But finding resources that are appropriate for your level can be difficult, but thankfully my friends over at Link make it really easy to do, who are sponsoring this video. I've learned over 28,000 Russian words using Link. The key is to listen and read to Russian at the same time and translate and save words that you don't know for later by clicking on them. Remember to review these words in spaced intervals either by using a spaced repetition system like Anki or Link's built-in review system for best results. They also tell you before you click on a lesson what percentage of the words you already know, so you don't have to waste your time sifting through resources that are either too easy or too difficult. Find something that interests you and read and listen to it multiple times to soak up as much as you can. I ate up the Russian with Max podcast back when I started learning in 2017, which I would highly recommend. Remember, 80 to 85% comprehension is the sweet spot, and the more words you learn and input you get, the easier it will all become. Remember that learning a language will never be as hard in the future as it is today. Let me say that again. Learning a language! It always gets easier the more time you put in. Remember that. Also remember to check out Link and their vast library of awesome resources in the description. While you're on this adventure of collecting words, you'll start to notice that there seem to be multiple words that only have one translation in English. For example, in my Link lessons, I've come across at least 5 different words that all translate to read, which brings us to the final thing that makes Russian difficult. Verbal aspect. Just like how for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, for every verb in Russian there is an equal and opposite verb. It's equal because they both have the same translation, but opposite because they carry different meanings. You could think of it like for every verb in English, there are 2 verbs in Russian. But what makes them different? It has to do with whether the action was finished to completion. Here are 2 verbs which both directly translate to read. If you put them both in the past tense, both sentences mean I read the book. So what's the difference? This is more of a general statement. Russians refer to these verbs as imperfective, and they're used when you want to emphasize the duration, repetition, or the fact that an action is still in progress. Without more information, we don't know whether someone read a chapter of the book, half of the book, how long they read it for, or is reading it for a second time. This is how Russian compensates for not having all the tenses that English does, like the present continuous and past perfective. It just uses imperfective verbs and context to express concepts like I've been reading, I was reading, and I am reading. This implies that I read the book to completion. It happened once and is for sure completed, done and dusted. Therefore, it is referred to as perfective. But how do you know which verbs are perfective and which are imperfective? Well, you just gotta memorize them. But perfective words are usually longer with some prefix at the start.
Say the line, Bart!
Except when they're not.
Yeah!
Which opens up a whole other can of worms. Remember those lovely motion verbs from before? Remember how specific they were? Well, you can make them even more specific by adding prefixes onto them. For the most part, you can just add them onto the beginning of any motion verb to give it more meaning. They're mostly directional, telling the speaker whether you're going in, out, around, away, across, through, up to, or away from your destination. For the most part, adding these prefixes is simple, except when it isn't. Here's a great example from storylearning.com that shows off prefixes really well. While these seem super intimidating at first, just like everything else in language learning, it becomes very intuitive and fun after a bit of practice. If you manage to take the time to learn and master the 3 hardest things about Russian plus prefixes, then you're definitely advanced. But this is only the beginning. Some of the richest, most beautiful, and most complicated literature ever written was written in the Russian language. There are even cases within cases, like the locative and vocative, old archaic cases like the partitive, hundreds of thousands of words, a vast amount of exceptions you'll run into along the way, and this is only scratching the surface. For every concept I explained in this video, I easily skipped over another 10. But now that you're advanced, this should be a good starting point. If you'd like to actually learn any of this stuff, I've left some awesome resources for you in the description. Hope they're useful. Have fun, and udacz jest udacz.